Hey, Ready, Set, Engage, episode 23. Have a couple topics. Really, there's one major topic, and then I wanted to talk really briefly about math and why I'll probably temper down my my heavily political videos for a while. It, as always, the views expressed here represent mine and mine alone, and not do not represent that of any organization that I'm affiliated with. So there's a couple topics tonight. One is the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. I think it's an important piece of history that really we don't talk about too much. In the 1990s, there was the War of the Gaza Strip, and I really didn't understand the historical significance of where that came from. And then this week apparently has really been a week for informing me about a little more of the history behind that war, where it comes from, and why we should pay attention. Like, yeah, pay attention to something, history from 20 years ago, but pay attention to history overall. And somebody had a very interesting comment on one of there's a thread where I'm discoursing with people over political views. So Above and Beyond, the movie, just watched it. Incredibly phenomenal movie. It has to do with the Israeli Air Force from 1948. Basically, for those who are unaware, there was the Arab-Israeli War that happened in 1948. And basically, on May 15th, 1948, the British forces chose to remove themselves from what was Palestine at the time. Okay, and the United Nations in 1947 had ruled that the state of Palestine should be broken up, or the country of Palestine should be broken up between Israel and Palestine. And the way they form the borders, I don't understand it. I need to learn more, which is a call to action here. Oh, sorry. So Above and Beyond, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the number of immigrants, Jewish immigrants or Jews in Israel at the time of the 1948 war, and why this is important. American Rifleman, which is something that the NRA either writes, promotes, or whatever. It's basically their magazine. Like, this is what it looks like. And one of the articles they had related to actually the FN Mauser, which gets back to the Israeli war. The help me learn more, the big call to action, like, hey, I don't know enough about the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. I'm fascinated by it, and I think there's a lot to be learned there, and would love to, hopefully, if it works out, get people to read about it or read interesting stuff and put it in the comments here, and just sort of start a discussion on history, because I feel like we don't do collective learning very well, if at all, in America these days. And then mathematics. So mathematics is actually, there was an article this week that said America was doing a really, really bad job in the math department. Like, just like from an educational perspective, our propensity for doing math is going downhill. And so I wanted to talk about some basic probability, and this relates to some of the videos I've done over time, and why I'll probably slow down on the number of political videos that I do, especially as relates to voting Democrat, Republican, whatever in the U.S. So Above and Beyond the movie. Above and Beyond the movie, it literally talks to a number of pilots from the Israeli Air Force that was founded in 1948. Like, basically, it was England was set to pull out of Israel, or pull out of Palestine in 1948, May 15th of 1948. And when that was set to happen, shit was set to hit the fan. Basically, in 1947, there was a UN resolution, and I thought I just had it open and I forgot the name of it. The Partition Plan, United Nations Partition Plan, April 2nd, 1947. Basically, this resolution came in front of the UN in 1947 on what to do with all the Jewish immigrants that were moving towards Palestine following World War II. And of course, some of them were coming from internment camps or death camps. Some of them were coming from persecution all across Europe. It actually does an interesting job at the very beginning of pointing out how in 1936 in America, there was actually a very heavy anti-Semite or anti-Semitist sort of viewpoint or culture that existed. And like, for those who don't know, before World War II, the U.S. was actually helping or working closely with Germany on eugenics and trying to, like, the idea was basically you kill off people who are ill, you kill off people who have mental deficiencies or deformities, like basically the non-primary or the people who were could be ruled as having, you know, imperfect genes, right? And that was in like the 1930s. And if you read up on eugenics, the history is that the U.S. was actually working closely with Germany. A lot of the research was actually in the U.S. And so in the 1930s, in the U.S. even, there was a heavy anti-Semitist view. And then you get into World War II, and of course, World War II winds up being a large number of Jewish people were put in internment camps. Many died at Auschwitz. It's a very tragic part of history, and I think people should pay attention. I think it behooves all of us to learn a little bit about history, and I definitely don't know enough, which is why when I learn something a little bit interesting, I would love to share it. So World War II ends. We went over Germany, right? And then you've got all these Jewish people that are still escaping sort of persecution in Europe and away from, definitely away from Germany. So they go to Palestine, Jerusalem area, Tel Aviv, etc. And they want to declare a Jewish state. And so the partition agreement, April of 1947, the UN votes by two-thirds of the UN. I think it was 13 dissenters and, like, I don't remember, it must have been at least 21 nations voted yes. It's somewhere in the history stuff. It's also in that video. Like, highly recommend that video. It's tremendous. Like, tears, giggles, love. Like, I absolutely loved it. So UN says, hey, we should do this thing. And then and then England's like, guess what? On May 15th, 1948, we're just going to remove ourselves from the entire situation and hope it goes well. Well, you had 600,000 Jewish people in that area, in the partition area. They displaced 700,000, I believe is the right number, of Palestinian people from that area. And then you had 50 million Arabs that were in the surrounding countries. Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan, I believe, were the ones involved. And so this day's coming, England's going to pull out. So on May 14th, the day before England's going to pull out, Israel declares its independence. And then they start a small Air Force. And the Air Force literally started out with like 3 or 4 planes. But the attack that they did, covered in this video, it was enough to hold off the Egyptian advance. And the Egyptians were, I think, 6 miles from, I believe it was Tel Aviv or the airport there. But they got attacked by this Air Force. The Air Force, so the video was into this in great detail, but to sum it up, or to cut it down a lot, there's a guy, what's his name, Al Schwimmer or something. There was a guy that started orchestrating to build the Air Force, and veterans at the time were able to buy former U.S. planes from World War II for $5,000. So he bought some planes, and then they disassembled them. They took them, and what happened was, after this declaration, the U.S. said, well, we're not getting into this. And so the U.S. actually created an embargo on sales of munitions and arms to the Middle East, which included Israel. Okay, so you couldn't sell the planes to Israel, to the Jewish people that now needed to defend this UN resolution that said, hey, these refugees get part of the country, etc. So the US bails out, England bails out. Basically, the Western countries are like, we're not in it. Okay, so this guy figures out how to smuggle these planes out of the U.S. They create an airline that flies out of Panama. Basically, it goes Panama, Brazil, Morocco, Italy, Czechoslovakia, okay, and then into Italy or into Israel. And so that's fascinating because Czechoslovakia in 1948 was actually, I believe, a free state. And then in the middle of the war, they were actually consumed by Stalin and the Soviet Union. Somewhere in this article, it covered it, and it talked a little about that history of when they were taken in, and I should have like highlighted it or something. But the interesting thing was that Russia decided that it was making money and decided not to cease the flow of arms from Czechoslovakia into Israel at the time, which meant that they had a base for I'm not going to be able to find it. Which meant that they had a base for the planes to fly into Czechoslovakia, and that's actually where the bombers flew out of, since there was still sort of the embargo and there was still this this sort of no-fly zone or inability to import munitions into the area. They flew out of Czechoslovakia, which then became part of the Soviet Union. Okay, so it's fascinating to me because one, the argument on this other thread was something along the lines of because like we should get rid of this. I'm going to poorly paraphrase it, but it was roughly, we should get rid of the Second Amendment because our munitions don't have the capability to override the military in an instance of tyranny or governmental attack, disarmament, or war against the populace. So like militias shouldn't exist because the military has arms. And to me, that's just a really bad argument. But to look at this point in history, in 1948, there were 600,000 Jewish immigrants, I believe is the right number. There's 50 million Arabs. There was 4 countries coming against this small country that was basically refugees, and the small country that was basically refugees defending their now appointed homeland actually wound up winning the war or getting declared a state in, I believe it might have been like January something of 1949. So like 8 months after the war began, which is interesting. The American Rifleman actually talks about munitions and arms, and I read it like a week ago. It's one of my sit on the pooper and read something interesting. And so it was talking about Fabrique Nationale. FN is the like FN 57, FN FAL are some notable arms out of that manufacturer. Those were basically imported into Czechoslovakia to arm the Israeli army as they were entering this war, the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. And so that arms manufacturer was basically like a bunch of surplus parts and stuff. They kind of threw them together. They wound up changing the rifling a bit. They were in, I think, 7.92 millimeter, and then went to the NATO rounds after the 1948 conflict. I think 1955 is when FN actually changed. So it's a really interesting bit of history, and I thought it was very peculiar. One that I found the Above and Beyond video. It was in the Amazon Prime video. It was recommended whatever. If you're interested, it's a really good video actually. I think it's got 4.5 stars, which is pretty reasonable, pretty good on Amazon. And then American Rifleman, which is like the free magazine that the NRA sends out to tell you all kinds of stuff. A lot of history on guns and some of the research and stuff that goes into some of the newer manufacturers. There's some really, really good and informative information in there. So that's a really long way of saying that I would love to come away from this video and learn more about what interests you over the last 100 years. What battle, war, engagement is interesting to you or is a notable piece of history. I wrote at some point about the Battle of Athens, which was in Athens, Georgia in 1940. It was either, I think it was 1946, where a number of veterans were basically being shook down by a local sheriff because they had a bunch of money coming back from the war. The governmental body at the time had been totally overrun by corruption, and so they actually took up arms against the government in that case and won. And so the Battle of Athens is a very interesting read. I don't remember where I posted about it. It's probably a year old now. But so there's that. And then, of course, today is the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. I think it's very interesting. I think history is very important to know, and I obviously don't know enough about it. So help me learn more. If you get some time, read a little bit about the Arab-Israeli War and post a little in the comments, or send me a thing on Messenger if you don't feel comfortable posting in the comments. I would love to learn more and learn collectively more. And the second part, or the second thing I have notes on, is mathematics. Okay. And so there was a $1.6 billion Mega Millions jackpot a week and a half ago, and your mathematical odds are 1 in 292 million of winning. And it's a very complex and confusing thing to understand, and I got pretty frustrated when trying. And the math I was coming out was I think 1 in 13 billion 600 million or something like that. And apparently you discount some of the numbers because of ordering or whatever. There's entire Wikipedia articles. They might make more sense to you than they made to me. They might be equally as confusing. I don't know. But so when you talk about probability, right? Basically, you're talking about, if you were to roll the dice, what's the likelihood that you would get that number over a given series? And so a die has 6 sides. If you continue to roll those, you would expect a 1 in 6 probability. A 1 in 6 probability is, it's like 18%. I'm gonna fuck up my math here. Maybe it's 0.1675. Should have looked that up. I think it's 16.75 or something like that. And so 16% of the time you would expect to roll that die, and you would get that 1 in 6 probability. Okay. So I've had basically 3, because one was like a rehash or a reinitiation of the conversation from episode 22, I believe. And the thumbnail has been garbled, and they've ran into technical difficulties. I'm a pretty technical guy. I haven't rebooted my computer. It's running the same as it's been since the last one. So you can judge on state. You're not going to get that far. So if you were to take, basically I'm at episode 23. 22 is bifurcated into 2. I've done, I think 3 videos. I had one, I actually did 22 kill last year, I think, on Facebook Live. And so it's probably more, but let's just use 25 because it's an easier number. Okay. So 1 in 25 as a probability, right? That's 4%. So 1 video out of 25 videos getting garbled, you would say, okay, that's 4%. Okay. And then you can look at the topics underneath that, and it was political, granted. Okay. So you have that. And then you have another video that gets garbled. Okay. Similar topics. Okay. So also a 4%. Well, the problem is if you have 4% and 4%, it's not half of that. It's not less of that. Instead, it's a probability of the potentials. Okay. So 1 in 25 here and 1 in 25 here actually become exponential. And so you do 1 in 25 times 1 in 25. Now you're 1 in 625. You're talking, I think it's 0.18 of a percentile, like less than a quarter of a percentile, that both of those got messed up, having similar topics just by random chance. And then you take and you add the third video. So 22 got bifurcated, and both bifurcations of that actually got cut short by technical difficulties. And so you've got 1 in 25, 1 in 25, and 1 in 25. And now you do the exponent of those 3, and so it's 25 cubed, which I believe is 1 in 15,625, or 0.0064% chance. That means, well, it means 1 in 15,000 potential chances that those exact 3 videos that we're talking about, heavily political topics, wound up running into technical difficulties. Like it's not lottery odds. It's not that astronomical, but it becomes pretty pretty disturbing from a mathematical perspective, and pretty unlikely that those exact 3 would run into similar issues, or issues specifically with Facebook. And so from that, I'm going to try and stay away from political discourse that's heavily left or right. You can call it tinfoil hat. You can call it recoverable risk. You can call it mitigated risk. I don't care what you call it. Like that's sort of the conclusion that I've come to, and I think Patty fully supports me and is kind of recommends that's the course that I go. So from a math perspective, a little bit of math, something you should look at when you're judging probability. When you're talking about lotto tickets, I think it's 72 numbers possible in each of your 6 slots, and so that's 72 to the 6th power. And then there's the number of lines or something that winds up cutting it down. I don't remember. It's because the ball is removed from the pool. But that's basically how to tell your odds for your lotto as well. So good bit of knowledge to have. You could put this in a calculator. It's easier than listen to me when I'm trying to remember what I queued into a calculator earlier or the other day. But so math is important, learning is important, history is incredibly important. So again, the Arab-Israeli War, 1948, started. Israel declared its independence in May 14th, 1948. It was about an 8-month war. I believe it ended January 5th of 1949, with Israel being declared an actual state and sort of getting a ceasefire, an armistice deal. Important piece of history, a small contingent of people making big noise to defend their liberties. And it was the Jewish people that had been displaced and subjugated during World War II, that were refugees at this time, that got abandoned by large governmental bodies or large nations after the United Nations voted that they should get a partition deal and be awarded part of Palestine. The U.S. was actually like cutting people's citizenship. And so I believe Al Schwimmer is the guy's name. It's in the video, so feel free to watch the video and keep me honest. His citizenship was revoked, and anyone that went to fight on the side of the Israelis had the threat of losing their citizenship in the United States. But they chose to go and defend the Jewish people nonetheless. I believe there were 3,500 foreign nationals that went and volunteered to fight in that war on the side of Israel. So some important history and some important things to keep in mind as we're voting about everything, as we're thinking about everything, and as we're talking about history and the impact of the decisions we make on the people around us. I think that's all I got. I look forward to learning from you. Hopefully you learned a little bit from me. Again, Above and Beyond, the movie, highly, highly recommend it. They spend a lot of time talking about some of the battles and interviewing actual pilots that joined the Israeli, what the fuck is Israel? Israeli Air Force, and like actually the formation of that. They wound up training a lot of pilots. Some of them wound up living in Israel for 30 years, a couple decades, because it was sort of a non-inviting environment back home for them. So very good video. The article on American Rifleman, it basically talks about Fabrique Nationale, the FN guns. It's interesting on that account, just on the history of those guns. For me, it was very interesting because it talked about the U.S.'s part It talked about Czechoslovakia. It talked about Panama and how Panama became sort of this hub for exportation, which then aligns almost directly, no, I think it is directly, with Above and Beyond and some of the history they talk about, just sort of in passing there. So an interesting coincidence or interesting opportunity that both of those things came up within, I think, the last week or two in my purview or field of reference. So I wanted to share that. And then, of course, math, it's important, probably can teach us lessons that we might otherwise miss. And that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching, and that's Ready, Set, and Engage, episode 23.